The afternoon heat pressed heavily against the city like a furnace. Sunlight reflected sharply off the glass towers downtown, turning the sidewalks into rivers of shimmering light. Traffic crawled through crowded intersections, while impatient horns echoed between buildings. People hurried past one another with their heads down, too consumed by deadlines and responsibilities to notice much else around them. Through the middle of the crowded sidewalk walked Ethan Cole, gripping a worn leather folder tightly against his chest. Inside it was a resume he had rewritten more times than he could count. Every line had been carefully adjusted. Every word had been chosen with hope. Today mattered. After nearly 8 months of surviving on temporary jobs, unpaid bills, and sleepless nights, Ethan was finally heading toward an opportunity that could change everything. Hartwell Dynamics was one of the largest companies in the city, and somehow he had managed to secure an interview for an entry-level operations position. It was the kind of chance people waited years for. His white dress shirt had been ironed 3 times the night before. His shoes were old, but polished carefully until they looked almost new. All morning, he had repeated interview answers quietly to himself while riding the bus downtown. He couldn't afford to fail. As Ethan approached the final intersection before the company building, the pedestrian light changed. People moved forward in waves across the crosswalk. Then suddenly, someone collapsed. A young woman stumbled near the center of the street before falling hard against the pavement. Several pedestrians stopped briefly, startled by the sight, but most quickly continued walking. A few glanced over with mild concern before moving on. Ethan froze. The towering Hartwell Dynamics building stood less than a block away. He checked the time on his phone. The interview was supposed to begin in 12 minutes. The woman tried to push herself up, but her arms trembled violently beneath her. Her blonde hair partially covered her face, and the bright red dress she wore stood out sharply against the gray concrete. People kept walking around her. Ethan looked again toward the building ahead of him. Then, he looked back at the woman struggling to breathe. For a brief second, he hesitated. Then he turned and rushed toward her. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" The woman nodded weakly, though her breathing remained uneven. Sweat covered her forehead despite the dry heat. "I'm okay," she whispered. "No, you're not." Carefully, Ethan helped her sit upright while traffic continued moving nearby. Her hands shook uncontrollably. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena." "All right, Lena. Let's get you out of the sun." He guided her slowly toward a nearby bus stop bench beneath a small shaded awning. She moved unsteadily, leaning against him for support. Once seated, she closed her eyes tightly and tried to steady her breathing. Ethan handed her his water bottle. "Small sips," he said calmly. She obeyed, though her hands trembled so badly he eventually had to help hold the bottle steady. Minutes passed slowly. Ethan checked his phone again. 7 minutes until the interview. His stomach tightened. He looked toward the office tower in the distance, then back at Lena. She still looked pale and exhausted. "You should probably go," she said softly between breaths. "You look like you're heading somewhere important." "I'm fine," Ethan replied. But he wasn't fine. His chest felt tight with anxiety. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. Months of applications, rejections, and disappointment hung in the balance. Still, he stayed. He helped Lena regulate her breathing, while she explained quietly that she hadn't slept properly in days. She admitted she'd barely eaten all week because of work stress. "I thought I could push through it," she said weakly. "You can't run yourself into the ground like that." She gave a faint, embarrassed laugh. "I guess I found that out." Nearly 15 minutes later, Lena finally looked steadier. Ethan used her phone to help her request a ride home. When the black sedan arrived, she turned toward him before getting inside. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have." Ethan forced a small smile. "Take care of yourself." Then he hurried toward Hartwell Dynamics as fast as he could. By the time he entered the massive lobby, he already knew. The receptionist behind the marble desk looked up politely as Ethan approached, breathless and sweating. "I'm here for the operations interview," he said. "Ethan Cole." The receptionist checked her screen, then gave him an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole. The interview session ended 20 minutes ago." His heart sank. "There has to be someone I can still speak with," he said quickly. "I was delayed because—" The hiring panel already left for another meeting. Ethan stood silently for a moment. The massive lobby suddenly felt colder than before. Employees in expensive suits moved through the building confidently, while he remained standing there, feeling completely out of place. "I understand," he said quietly. The receptionist offered him a sympathetic smile, but sympathy changed nothing. Outside, the city no longer looked hopeful. Over the next week, Ethan returned to the exhausting routine he knew too well. During the mornings, he delivered packages across town beneath the blazing heat. At night, he cleaned grocery store aisles after closing hours. Some days he worked inventory shifts at warehouses just to cover transportation costs and groceries. Bills piled up on the small kitchen table inside his apartment. The landlord had already left 2 warning notices. Yet despite everything, Ethan never regretted helping Lena. He only wondered if kindness actually mattered anymore in a world where survival seemed to reward selfishness instead. One rainy evening, while unloading heavy boxes at a warehouse loading dock, his phone rang unexpectedly. He almost ignored it. Unknown numbers usually meant debt collectors. But after the 3rd ring, he answered. "Hello? May I speak with Ethan Cole?" a calm woman asked. "This is Ethan. My name is Maya Bennett. I'm calling from Hartwell Dynamics." Ethan straightened immediately. I'm sorry?" "You've been requested for a meeting tomorrow morning with Mr. Richard Hartwell." Ethan blinked in confusion. "The CEO?" "Yes, he requested you personally." For several seconds, Ethan couldn't speak. "There must be some mistake," he finally said. "There's no mistake, Mr. Cole. Will you be attending?" The next morning, Ethan stood once again inside the towering Hartwell Dynamics building. But this time, confusion replaced hope. An assistant escorted him to the executive floor overlooking the city skyline. The office he entered was enormous, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows glowing with morning sunlight. Behind a polished desk sat Richard Hartwell, one of the most powerful business leaders in the state. And seated beside him was Lena. She looked completely different from the exhausted woman Ethan had helped days earlier. Her posture was composed, and her face carried color again. The moment she saw him, she smiled warmly. "Hi, Ethan." He stared at her in disbelief. Richard Hartwell stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for coming." Ethan shook it cautiously. "I don't really understand why I'm here." "You helped my daughter," Richard said calmly. Ethan looked back at Lena. "She's your daughter?" Lena nodded. For a moment, Ethan could only stare silently. Richard gestured for him to sit. "Lena told me everything," he continued. "She said you stayed with her even after realizing you were late for your interview." Ethan shifted awkwardly. "It wasn't a big deal." "It was," Lena said softly. "You were the only person who stopped." The room fell quiet. Lena explained how weeks of pressure and exhaustion had pushed her beyond her limits. A major project failure inside the company had left her terrified she'd disappointed her father and damaged the company's reputation. "I hadn't slept properly in days," she admitted. "I thought I could handle it alone." Richard sighed quietly, the concern of a father replacing the image of a powerful executive. Then he turned toward Ethan again. "You know," he said, "thousands of people apply to work here every year. Most of them arrive early, dressed professionally, saying all the right things." Ethan listened silently. But character reveals itself in moments when there's nothing to gain. Richard folded his hands carefully. "You chose compassion over opportunity. That matters to me far more than a resume." Ethan felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in his chest. Richard slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an official job offer, not for the original entry-level position. This role offered full benefits, training, and a significantly better salary as an assistant operations coordinator. Ethan looked up, stunned. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Lena replied with a smile. For the first time in months, Ethan laughed softly. As he left the building later that afternoon, the city no longer felt cold or indifferent. The same streets that once carried disappointment now seemed filled with possibility. The harsh sunlight from the week before had faded into the warm glow of evening, casting long golden reflections across the towers downtown. Sometimes life closed one door, only to lead someone toward a better one. And sometimes, the quiet moments when nobody was watching became the very moments that changed everything forever.